on a lonely road outside Lincoln, New Mexico territory. He was 24 years old, a British rancher who'd been in the territory less than 2 years. The men who killed him were wearing badges. They had warrants. They were technically acting under color of law, and yet every witness, including members of the posse itself, would later testify that it was murder. Cold-blooded murder committed by law enforcement officers in broad daylight. Among the witnesses was an 18-year-old ranch hand who'd been riding with Tunstall. His name was William Bonney, though history knows him as Billy the Kid. He watched his employer, perhaps the only man who'd ever treated him with genuine kindness, get gunned down by men with badges. And in that moment, something changed. Billy the Kid became Billy the Kid. What happened next was the Lincoln County War. 5 months of violence that killed at least 19 men, destroyed the territorial government's credibility, and demonstrated something disturbing about the American frontier. Sometimes the law wasn't the opposite of lawlessness. Sometimes the law was just another tool of lawlessness, wielded by whoever had enough power to claim it. 3 things are true about February 18th, 1878. John Tunstall was murdered by a legally constituted posse. The legal system itself was corrupted by business interests to the point where murder could be committed under color of law. And Billy the Kid's transformation from ranch hand to outlaw was a direct response to the complete failure of legal justice. The tragedy isn't that the law failed. The tragedy is that the law itself became the weapon. Picture this: the road from Lincoln to Tunstall's ranch, 40 miles through the empty high desert of southern New Mexico. It's February, cold at this altitude, the mountains still carrying snow. Tunstall is riding with 5 of his men, bringing horses from his ranch back to Lincoln. They've been dealing with legal harassment for months, bogus warrants, seizure orders, threats. The whole thing is about a business rivalry that spiraled into a war for control of the entire county's economy. But today the threats have become real. Sheriff William Brady's posse, maybe 25 or 30 men, has been following them. Around noon, on a stretch of road flanked by low hills, the posse closes in. Tunstall's men scatter. Most head for the hills. Billy Bonney and Fred Waite ride hard for the nearest cover, expecting Tunstall to follow. But Tunstall doesn't run. Maybe he thinks his British citizenship protects him. Maybe he believes that because he's done nothing illegal, the law will protect him. Maybe he just can't quite believe that men wearing badges would actually kill him. He rides toward the posse, alone, unarmed, apparently intending to surrender peacefully and sort the whole thing out in town. 2 men break away from the main posse, Jesse Evans and Tom Hill. Both are known outlaws, rustlers, horse thieves, men with prices on their heads who've somehow gotten themselves deputized for this particular job. They ride up to Tunstall. From the hillside where Billy and the others are watching, they hear shots. Tunstall falls from his horse. One of the killers shoots Tunstall's horse. Then, in a gesture whose meaning everyone will argue about, but whose symbolism no one can deny, they place Tunstall's own revolver under his head as if he'd shot himself and cover him with his coat. Billy Bonney watches the whole thing. He's 18, born in New York, raised in rough mining camps after his father died and his mother remarried. He's been drifting through the West since he was 15, working odd jobs, getting into occasional trouble, nothing serious. He came to Lincoln County a year ago and hired on with Tunstall. And Tunstall treated him decently, paid him fair wages, treated him like a person rather than disposable labor. Maybe even saw potential in the quick, intelligent kid. Now Billy's watching Tunstall's body lying in the dirt, killed by men with badges, and something in him calculates the equation. There is no law here. There's only power. And if you want justice, you're going to have to take it yourself. Let me build the clock for you so you understand how we got to murder under color of law. Lincoln County in 1878 is frontier capitalism in its purest, most brutal form. The county is enormous, bigger than some eastern states, but the population is tiny. Maybe 3,000 people scattered across hundreds of miles of desert, mountains, and high plains. The economy runs on beef. The Army fort needs beef. The Apache reservations need beef. The merchants need beef to sell. Whoever controls the beef contracts controls the county. For years, that control belonged to Lawrence Murphy and James Dolan, Irish immigrants who built an empire called the House. Murphy-Dolan owned the general store, the bank, the brewery. They held the government beef contracts. They controlled the prices. If you were a small rancher or farmer, you sold to them at their prices, or you didn't sell at all. If you needed credit, you borrowed from them at their rates. If you couldn't pay, they took your property. They owned the county economically, and because the county was so poor and isolated, economic control also meant political control. Murphy and Dolan were also involved with the Santa Fe Ring, a network of lawyers, politicians, and businessmen who controlled New Mexico territorial politics. The ring had connections to the governor, the attorney general, judges, and federal appointments. When you fought Murphy-Dolan, you weren't just fighting a business. You were fighting a political machine with tentacles reaching all the way to Washington. Then John Tunstall arrived. He was the younger son of a wealthy British merchant family. He'd come to America seeking opportunity, landed in Santa Fe, saw the fortunes being made in territorial New Mexico, and decided to get in on it. He was educated, cultured, spoke with a British accent, and dressed like an English gentleman. He was also shrewd, ambitious, and didn't mind confrontation when he thought he was in the right. Tunstall partnered with Alexander McSween, a lawyer who'd recently broken with Murphy-Dolan over a business dispute. Together with rancher John Chisholm, they formed what became known as the Regulators faction, though that name wouldn't come until later. They opened a competing general store. They went after the beef contracts. They offered better prices to local ranchers. They challenged the House's monopoly. Murphy and Dolan saw them as existential threats. This wasn't just competition. This was someone trying to break their control of the entire county economy. So they fought back with every tool they had, legal and otherwise. They got a judge to issue warrants. They got the sheriff, William Bonney, to seize property. They used friendly newspapers to smear their opponents. When that didn't work, they employed men with guns. Men like Jesse Evans and his gang, outlaws who'd been rustling cattle and robbing stages, but who suddenly found themselves deputized and working for the House. This is where it gets complicated, where the line between law and lawlessness disappears completely. Sheriff Brady was a legitimate lawman, elected by the voters. The warrants were real, signed by a judge. The posse had legal authority to seize property and arrest people. On paper, everything was legal. But everyone in Lincoln County knew the truth. The judge was aligned with Murphy-Dolan. The sheriff was on the House's payroll. The warrants were bogus, manufactured legal pretexts. The seizures were theft dressed up in legal documents. And the deputized posse was mostly made up of known criminals doing Murphy-Dolan's dirty work under the protection of badges. This is what made Tunstall's murder so significant. It wasn't an outlaw killing a lawman, or a lawman killing an outlaw. It was the law itself, corrupted, weaponized, committing murder. And everyone knew it. Even the territorial governor, Samuel Axtell, who was himself allied with the Santa Fe Ring and generally supported Murphy-Dolan, eventually had to acknowledge that something had gone terribly wrong. Billy Bonney and the other Tunstall hands brought the body back to Lincoln. They laid it out at McSween's house. And that's when Billy made his choice. He could ride away, find work elsewhere, stay clear of the brewing war. Or he could stay and fight. Not for law. Law had failed completely. But for justice, for vengeance, for the principle that you don't let men get away with murder just because they're wearing badges. He stayed. So did about a dozen other Tunstall hands and local men who were fed up with Murphy-Dolan's reign. They called themselves the Regulators. They had their own legal fig leaf. A justice of the peace named John Wilson issued them special constable appointments, giving them legal authority to arrest Tunstall's killers. But everyone understood what the Regulators really were, a private army gathered to fight a private war. They weren't interested in legal process. They were interested in killing the men who'd killed their employer. And over the next 5 months, that's exactly what they did. April 1st, 1878, the Regulators ambushed Sheriff Brady and 4 deputies on Lincoln's Main Street. Brady and Deputy George Hindman die in the first volley. Billy the Kid runs out to take Brady's rifle and gets shot in the thigh. 3 more wounded. The Regulators escape into McSween's house. April 4th, 1878, the Regulators corner Andrew Buckshot Roberts, another man involved in Tunstall's murder at Blazer's Mill. Roberts kills Dick Brewer, the Regulators' leader, before dying of his own wounds. July 15th through the 19th of 1878, the Battle of Lincoln. Sheriff George Pepin, Brady's replacement, brings a 40-man posse to arrest McSween and the Regulators. They surround McSween's house. For 4 days there's a siege, hundreds of shots fired, neither side able to force a conclusion. Then on the 5th day, the posse sets McSween's house on fire. As the Regulators flee the burning building, McSween and 4 others are shot down. Billy the Kid escapes into the darkness. 19 men died in the Lincoln County War. Some were Regulators. Some were aligned with Murphy-Dolan. Some were just in the wrong place when the shooting started. The territorial economy was disrupted. Ranches were burned. Cattle were rustled by both sides to fund their operations. The federal government eventually had to step in, removing Governor Axtell and appointing Lew Wallace, yes, the man who would later write Ben-Hur, as the new territorial governor with explicit instructions to end the violence. Wallace offered amnesty to most participants. The violence gradually subsided. Murphy had already died of illness in 1878. Dolan's business empire collapsed. The house's monopoly was broken. Billy the Kid kept riding with various outlaw bands, rustling cattle, evading capture, and building his legend. In 1881, Sheriff Pat Garrett, a former friend, hunted him down and shot him dead in a darkened room. He was 21 years old. Here's what troubles me about the Lincoln County War. Both sides claimed to represent law and order. Murphy-Dolan had the actual legal apparatus, the sheriff, the courts, the warrants. The Regulators had the moral case. Their employer was murdered, and they sought justice. But by the end, both sides were just armed factions fighting for control, killing each other whenever they got the chance. The law didn't prevent the violence. The law was the excuse for the violence. Every killing, every ambush, every raid was justified by someone's interpretation of legal authority. Sheriff Brady's posse killed Tunstall under a warrant. The Regulators killed Brady under a constable's commission. The siege of McSween's house was a lawful arrest operation. The defense of McSween's house was a lawful resistance to an unlawful arrest. Everybody had a legal theory. Everybody had paperwork, and 19 people ended up dead. This wasn't unique to Lincoln County. Across the frontier west, you saw variations of the same pattern. In places where traditional legal structures were weak or absent, whoever had economic power could capture the legal apparatus. They could get their people elected sheriff. They could influence judges. They could manufacture legal justifications for whatever they wanted to do. And then when their opponents fought back, as they inevitably did, both sides would claim to be upholding law and order while they shot each other in the streets. The mythology we've built around the West misses this completely. In the movies, you have clear lines: lawmen versus outlaws, good guys versus bad guys, civilization versus savagery. Billy the Kid becomes either a romantic outlaw hero or a cold-blooded killer, depending on who's telling the story. But the real Billy the Kid was neither. He was an 18-year-old kid who watched his employer get murdered by the sheriff's men and concluded correctly that the legal system was irretrievably corrupt. He chose violence not instead of law, but because law had failed so completely that it became just another weapon in a business war. I'm not defending that choice. Violence isn't justice, even when justice has failed. The regulators killed men who probably weren't even present at Tunstall's murder. They turned personal vengeance into a private war. They made things worse, not better. But I understand the choice. When the law becomes just another tool of the powerful, when badges and warrants and court orders are just cover for theft and murder, what's left? How do you seek justice when justice itself is corrupt? The answer, I think, is that you can't, not through individual action anyway. Real justice requires systems that work. It requires legal institutions that maintain enough independence to resist capture by economic interests. It requires a community consensus that law means something beyond whatever serves my interests right now. Lincoln County in 1878 had none of that. It had competing factions with competing legal theories, all backed by guns. The result was exactly what you'd expect: chaos, violence, and 19 dead men. We've built those systems now, mostly. Modern law enforcement isn't perfect, far from it. But it's not the same as a sheriff who's effectively a private security force for the local business monopoly. Our courts aren't perfect, but they're not the same as a single judge controlled by one faction. The separation between economic power and legal authority isn't complete, but it exists in ways it didn't in territorial New Mexico. And yet, we still see echoes of the Lincoln County War whenever legal institutions get captured by powerful interests. When the law seems to protect some people and not others. When badges and legal authority feel like tools of power rather than instruments of justice. The specific mechanisms change, but the pattern remains. When law becomes just another weapon in a power struggle, violence follows. Billy the Kid didn't become an outlaw because he was evil. He became an outlaw because he watched the law commit murder and concluded there was no meaningful difference between the two. That's the real tragedy of February 18th, 1878. Not just that a good man was killed, but that his killing demonstrated how completely the legal system had failed. I think about the choice Billy faced. 18 years old, watching his employer's body in the dirt, killed by men with badges. You can ride away and let them get away with it, or you can stay and fight